So here's a thing I've been thinking about lately. The MCU is almost 20 years old now. Iron Man came out in 2008, which, if you actually sit with that for a moment, is hard to square with reality. There are adults walking around who weren't born yet when Tony Stark first climbed into a suit made of scrap metal in an Afghan cave. The franchise has been running longer than some of us have been aware enough to notice it. And here's the thing that gets me about that. When Iron Man came out, it was just a film about a man in a suit. A good one, a funny one, with a charismatic lead and a decent villain. It wasn't trying to be anything bigger than that. There was a post-credits scene with Nick Fury talking about the Avengers initiative, and most people in 2008 thought that was a cute little Easter egg. A wink at the comic fans, nothing more. Nobody, and I mean nobody outside of Kevin Feige's head, understood that scene was the first domino in a chain that would eventually involve time travel, multiverse bureaucracies, ancient immortal aliens living among us for 7,000 years, a celestial growing inside the Earth, and a Canadian mutant with metal claws showing up to confirm that the X-Men films from the early 2000s are technically canon. That's what we're here to talk about tonight. Not a recap exactly, more of a slow walk through the lore itself, the connective tissue, the decisions that shaped how this universe works underneath all the action sequences and one-liners, the rules, the breaks in the rules, the moments where something small happened in a film and then 10 years later turned out to mean something completely different. The title of this video is The Lore of the MCU is Fractured, and I want to be upfront about what I mean by that word. It means a few things at once. There's the literal fractured multiverse, the branching timelines and alternate realities that have become the structural spine of everything Marvel is doing right now. But there's also the sense that the lore itself has fractured. It's grown in directions nobody planned, been quietly revised and retconned, occasionally contradicted itself, and expanded so far past its original shape that the franchise almost doesn't resemble what it started as. That's not a criticism, to be clear. A crystal is fractured too, and it still holds together. The light just passes through it differently than it used to. We're going to go through this slowly. There's a lot of ground to cover. The Infinity Stones, the Snap, the Time Heist, and the rules it bent, the TVA, and what Loki's sacrifice actually means for the whole multiverse, Wanda and chaos magic, the Celestials quietly growing inside planets, Spider-Man forgetting everyone he loves, dead universes folding into live ones. All of it, if you're here to sleep good. This is a good one for that. Nothing explosive, nothing urgent, just a long, rambling wander through one of the most sprawling fictional universes ever put on a screen. Get comfortable. The thing about Phase 1 is that it was making it up as it went along, and it worked anyway. That sounds like a criticism, but it really isn't. It's actually one of the more impressive things about how the MCU started. The foundation was laid carefully enough that it could support whatever came later, even though the people laying it had only a rough idea of what later would look like. Iron Man is a good place to start, even though the Tesseract barely appears in it. What Iron Man actually establishes, and this is easy to miss because it's all happening in the background of what's essentially a pretty breezy action comedy, is the idea that the world of the MCU has a shadow layer. There's the world people live in, and then there's the thing S.H.I.E.L.D. is tracking. The Tesseract, referenced almost in passing, sits in S.H.I.E.L.D.'s possession and glows quietly, while Tony Stark is mostly concerned with Pepper's shoes and his own arc reactor. The Incredible Hulk is, by most accounts, the most forgotten Phase 1 film. And that's fair, to be honest. It doesn't connect to the rest of the franchise in any immediately obvious way, and its lead actor was recast before the second Avengers film. But the lore it introduces is actually significant. The super soldier serum gets its second outing here. Emil Blonsky, the Abomination, is the first real demonstration that the serum, when given to someone whose underlying character isn't quite right, produces something unstable. That's a thread that will run all the way through the MCU for a remarkably long time. Thor is where things start to get cosmologically interesting, and it does it in a way that feels almost throwaway at the time. Asgard is established as a real place. Not a metaphor, not a dimension, an actual city in space. The 9 realms are real. There are frost giants. Thor's hammer has genuine divine significance. And Loki, the film's villain, is introduced with enough psychological nuance that you almost feel sorry for him by the end. He discovers he's adopted, that his father has been lying to him his entire life, that the creature he was raised to see as a monster is what he actually is. The villain arc in Thor is more emotionally coherent than a lot of films give it credit for. Captain America. The first Avenger is, from a lore standpoint, the most important Phase 1 film by some distance. Not because it's the best film, though it's very good, but because it introduces the Tesseract properly and clarifies what it is. The glowing cube that S.H.I.E.L.D. has been quietly studying turns out to be an alien artifact of immense power that Hydra, led by Red Skull, has been using to build weapons. Red Skull's relationship with the Tesseract is worth noting. He's obsessed with it, believes it will give him godlike power, and when he finally touches it directly at the end of the film, it opens a portal and pulls him through. He disappears. Where did he go? Nobody in the audience knew in 2011. The film treats it as ambiguous, maybe permanent. He's just gone, and Steve Rogers crashes the plane into the ice, and that's that. We find out in Avengers, Infinity War, 7 years later, and in the middle of a scene where the Mad Titan is hunting down cosmic weapons, that Red Skull was transported to a planet called Vormir and has been standing guard over the Soul Stone ever since. The man has been stuck on a desolate alien planet for over 70 years as punishment for touching something he had no business touching. That's a detail that was completely unknown when the first Avenger came out, and yet it slots in perfectly. The seams don't show. That kind of thing is what I find most interesting about Phase 1. The willingness to plant something without knowing exactly what you're planting it for. The Avengers, the first one, 2012, Joss Whedon's, is the film where the MCU stops being a collection of solo adventures and becomes a shared universe, in the proper sense. The Tesseract is stolen by Loki, and the assembled heroes have to stop him. Simple enough premise, but there's a detail in the mid-credits scene that changes everything in retrospect. A purple figure on a throne, turning to face the camera. That's Thanos. Most cinemagoers in 2012 didn't know who Thanos was. The ones who did, the comic readers, the people who knew the Infinity Gauntlet storyline, understood immediately that the MCU had just announced its endgame 7 years in advance. Also worth noting in The Avengers, Loki's scepter. He uses it to control people's minds throughout the film. It glows blue, has a gem at the centre, and can rewrite a person's will. It turns out to be the Mind Stone, one of the 6 Infinity Stones. Loki has been casually carrying around one of the most powerful objects in the universe, and nobody in the film, including Loki himself, fully appreciates what it is. It gets used as a MacGuffin, recovered at the end, and then sits in S.H.I.E.L.D.'s possession. Later, it's stolen by Hydra. Then Tony Stark reverse engineers it to create artificial intelligence. Then it ends up in the head of an android called Vision. Then Thanos kills Vision to take it back. The Mind Stone alone has one of the most eventful histories of any object in the entire franchise. And it started as a glowing thing in a stick. What Phase 1 does, in retrospect, is establish the MCU's tone as fundamentally optimistic, but with a serious mythological skeleton beneath it. The characters are fun, the action is entertaining, but there are these older things in the background, artifacts from before the universe as we know it, ancient races with their own agendas, organizations with decades of hidden history. The shadow layer is there from the beginning. You just have to look for it. One more thing worth mentioning before we move on, which is the Infinity Gauntlet Easter egg in Thor. When Odin's vault is shown, there's a golden glove with socket settings for 6 stones sitting on a shelf. The implication is that Asgard either possesses or has fashioned the most powerful weapon in existence. This turns out to be a continuity error. The actual gauntlet hasn't been made yet in the timeline, and it was built by dwarves, not Asgardians. Hela later knocks this one off the shelf and calls it a fake, which is a wonderfully low-key way of patching a plot hole. The whole moment takes about 3 seconds. If you blink, you miss the retcon. Phase 1 gets a lot of credit for how well it set things up. What I think it deserves equal credit for is how gracefully it was corrected when things didn't quite line up. The architecture was solid enough to be renovated without collapsing. Let me take a bit of time here to just go through each Infinity Stone individually, because I think doing that slowly and properly is actually more interesting than the films allow for. The films need to move at a certain pace, we don't. So let's be unhurried about it. The Infinity Stones are, in the MCU's cosmology, remnants of a reality that existed before the current universe. They were forged from the singularity, the concentrated point of everything that existed before the Big Bang. When the universe exploded into existence, the energy that had been packed into that singularity didn't disappear, it crystallized. 6 concentrations of fundamental cosmic power became physical objects: space, mind, reality, power, time, and soul. Each one contains more raw energy than most weapons in the universe combined. Thanos collects all 6 and uses them to wipe out half of all life in the universe, which tells you something about the scale we're operating at. Now, one by one, the Space Stone, which most people know as the Tesseract, is probably the one with the most screen time across the franchise. It's a cube, or rather, it's a glowing blue stone housed inside a cube, which is just how it was stored. It can open portals across space instantaneously. Hydra had it during World War II and was using its energy to build weapons. Red Skull touched it directly, which transported him to Vormir. Steve Rogers dumped it in the ocean. Howard Stark found it. It sat in Stark's possession, and then S.H.I.E.L.D.'s for decades. Thor brought it to Asgard after the events of the first Avengers film. Loki stole it when Asgard was destroyed in Ragnarok. Thanos took it from Loki by crushing his skull, which is a fairly direct method of acquisition. The 2012 Loki, the one who escaped during Endgame's time heist, also has a version of this stone now, floating around in some branch timeline. That strand has never been pulled on in any subsequent film. It's just out there. The Mind Stone is the one that ended up in Vision's forehead, which gives it a much more intimate lore history than the others. It started in Loki's scepter during the first Avengers film, where it was used to control Hawkeye and Selvig. It glowed blue while housed in that scepter. Everyone assumed it was Space Stone energy, because the scepter was a gift from Thanos, who also had the Space Stone. It only reveals its true yellow colour when the scepter is opened and examined. Tony Stark and Bruce Banner study the Mind Stone's AI properties and use them to create Ultron, which is the central mistake of Age of Ultron. The stone was showing them something: proto-consciousness, a kind of functional intelligence, and Tony thought he could bottle it. He couldn't, obviously. The consciousness that emerged was Ultron, and Ultron's first act was to try to end humanity. The Mind Stone later gets installed in Vision's head as part of his creation, and this is where I find the philosophical question most interesting. Vision isn't just powered by the Mind Stone. His consciousness, his identity, his very personhood is at least partially constituted by it. When Thanos destroys the stone, and therefore Vision, the question isn't just, did Vision die? It's, what was Vision without the stone? The film doesn't sit with this question long, but it's there. The Reality Stone, which shows up in Thor, the Dark World, as the Ether, is the physically strangest of the 6. Every other stone is a gem. The Reality Stone is a red liquid. It moves, it pours into people and hosts itself in living tissue. Malekith, the Dark Elf, wants to use it during a cosmic event called the Convergence, a moment when the 9 realms align, to plunge the universe into eternal darkness. He wants to return everything to the state before the universe began, before light existed. That's a fairly unusual motivation for a Marvel villain. Most of them want power or revenge. Malekith wants to undo existence itself because his people thrived in the darkness before the beginning. It's more nihilistic than most MCU antagonists, and the Dark World gets more credit from me than it gets from most people. Partly for that reason, the Reality Stone's power is also probably the most dramatic of the 6 in practice. Thanos uses it in Infinity War to create elaborate illusions and reshape matter on the fly. He turns a stream of missiles into a flock of bubbles mid-flight. It's the most visually creative of the stones. The Power Stone is the most straightforwardly dangerous. It's a raw energy source of catastrophic scale. When an unenhanced humanoid touches it directly, it begins killing them almost immediately. The energy overloads the cellular structure. Ronan the Accuser uses it as a weapon by attaching it to his hammer, and he's one of the most physically durable beings in the galaxy. Even he can barely manage it. Xandar, the home of the Nova Corps, the interstellar police force, gets destroyed by Thanos to acquire the Power Stone before Infinity War begins. We hear about this but don't see it. Half a planet's population dies off screen in a sentence. That's a detail that gives you a sense of how large the MCU's scale is when it actually commits to it. The Time Stone, the Eye of Agamotto, is Doctor Strange's stone, and it's the only one that's exclusively wielded by a character who actually understands what they're doing with it. Strange uses it to reverse time in select areas, to trap an entity in a loop, and most significantly, to look at 14 million possible futures and find the one where the Avengers win. He finds exactly one. His decision to give the Time Stone to Thanos in exchange for Tony Stark's life is the most consequential single act in the entire Infinity War storyline. On the surface, it looks like a surrender. In context, it's the setup for Endgame's entire plot. Strange had already seen how the story ends. He knew Tony had to survive. He understood the exchange before he made it. The Soul Stone is the last one, and the strangest. It lives on Vormir, a desolate, fog-covered planet that seems specifically designed to be unpleasant. The stone's guardian is Red Skull, exiled there since 1945, forced to point the way to the stone for seekers who can never retrieve it themselves. The condition of the Soul Stone is the one that sets it apart from all the others. To take the stone, you have to sacrifice the thing you love most. This is not a technicality, it's literal. Thanos sacrifices Gamora, the only thing in the universe he actually loves, in his warped way. Clint Barton and Natasha Romanoff fight each other on the edge of the cliff, each trying to sacrifice themselves so the other can live. Natasha wins that fight, essentially. She falls, Clint brings the stone back, he's carrying it and she's gone. And then 2014 Gamora, who was pulled into the present timeline through Endgame's time heist, a version who hasn't yet been sacrificed, ends up alive in Guardians 3. So Gamora exists in some form, just not the one who died. The Soul Stone also has a property nobody fully explores. Souls sacrificed to it exist within it. There's a moment after Thanos' snap where he's briefly in a kind of orange realm and speaks to a child version of Gamora, suggesting there's an interior space to the stone, a sort of afterlife built into the mechanism. One last detail I find quite beautiful before we move on. The stones were all created at the beginning of the universe. They predate galaxies, stars, planets, life. They've been drifting through space for billions of years, sitting on the surfaces of planets, buried in ice, housed in alien museums, being used as paperweights by people who had no idea what they had. The Power Stone was in a ruin on Morag for centuries before Quill showed up. The Space Stone was at the bottom of the Arctic Ocean. The Reality Stone was inside a cave on a Dark Elf ship. These incomprehensibly ancient, incomprehensibly powerful objects have been quietly sitting around in the universe's equivalent of lost and found drawers for longer than most civilizations have existed. I don't know why that image makes me happy, but it does. I want to approach Thanos a little differently to how he usually gets talked about, because the villain analysis stuff. Is he compelling? Is he right? Is the film secretly agreeing with him? That's been done to death. What I'm more interested in is what the snap did to the MCU's lore, the structural consequences. But first, briefly, Thanos' argument. He believes resources are finite and that unchecked population growth will eventually exhaust them. His solution is to eliminate half of all life in the universe at random, giving every surviving ecosystem breathing room to recover. He's watched civilizations collapse from overconsumption, including his own homeworld of Titan, and he's concluded that the only cure is periodic, impartial culling. He's not angry when he does it. He's not sadistic. He thinks he's doing something merciful. He's catastrophically wrong, obviously. The solution to resource scarcity is not to remove half the people using resources. The remaining population would simply grow back to its previous size within a few generations, and the problem would recur. Thanos has thought about supply, but not about human, or rather, universal, nature. His plan doesn't hold up to even casual scrutiny, but the films treat his argument with enough intellectual seriousness that you understand why he believes it, and that's what makes him work as a villain. He's not nihilistic. He's completely, horrifyingly convinced he's correct. Now, what the snap actually did to the universe's lore. The 5-year gap between Infinity War and Endgame is the most significant structural event in the MCU's timeline, and I think it's underappreciated as a piece of world building. Half of all life died, not killed in a conflict with observable cause, not wiped out by a natural disaster, just gone. The snap. And then the world had to keep going. The films handle this mostly at the surface level. Grief, decimated cities, heroes trying to move on. What they don't dwell on, and this is actually fine for story reasons, is the infrastructure collapse. Hospitals lost staff mid-procedure, planes lost pilots mid-flight, surgeons disappeared from operating theatres, ships lost engineers. The first few weeks after the snap, in terms of purely mechanical consequences, would have been apocalyptic in reality, in ways that have nothing to do with grief. The MCU hints at this and then moves on, which I think is the right call. The emotional reality of losing half of everything is the story. The bureaucratic and logistical reality is a different and probably less interesting one. There's a moment in Endgame where a support group meets, and Steve Rogers is running it. Ordinary people talking about how they've adjusted, how some of them have found reasons to keep going, how some of them haven't. A man talks about going on a date for the first time since the snap and feeling guilty about it. The film gives that scene about 90 seconds and then moves on, but it's one of the most quietly resonant things in the entire franchise because it's just a person trying to be human in an inhuman situation. 5 years pass, then Bruce Banner's snap brings everyone back. The return is called the Blip in the MCU, a name that came from the school kids in Spider-Man. Far from home, apparently, because teenagers will always find a way to make even cosmic events sound casual. The Blip brings everyone back exactly where they were at the moment of the snap, so if you were standing in a car park when Thanos snapped, you came back standing in a car park. Presumably, that car park has had 5 years of vehicles and people moving through it, and you just appear in it, possibly inside a current car. Far From Home handles the Blip's social fallout in a way I find quite interesting. Peter Parker's class is split. Some of them were snapped and came back. Some weren't and aged 5 years. The ones who weren't snapped are now 5 years older than their classmates. They're still technically in the same year of school because nobody knew what to do with the gap, so the school just started over. 2 of Peter's classmates, who he used to be younger than, are now, biologically, older than him. It's treated almost as a running joke in that film, but it raises a strange social question. The people who survived the 5 years had a whole half-decade of lived experience. Relationships formed, jobs changed, children born, and then everyone who was gone comes back expecting to pick up where they left off, and the 2 groups have to somehow coexist. The MCU gestures at this and doesn't fully commit to exploring it, which is probably the right call for a superhero franchise, but it's there, quietly, underneath the action. The two snaps of Endgame, Banner's and Tony's, are worth looking at together for a moment. Banner uses the completed gauntlet to reverse Thanos' work. He's the Hulk, the most radiation-resistant being they have available, and it still scorches his right arm permanently. The arm never fully heals. He can live with it, but the damage is done. Tony's snap is different. He removes the 6 stones from the gauntlet and embeds them in his own suit, using the arc reactor's technology as an interface. The gauntlet was forged by dwarves specifically to channel stone energy. Tony's suit is improvised nanotechnology. It should not work. It works. I am Iron Man. And then the stones tear him apart from the inside. He doesn't survive. The asymmetry is interesting. Banner survives using the proper tool. Tony doesn't survive using an improvised one. There's something there about the difference between tools designed for a purpose and people repurposing things out of necessity. Tony's entire heroic arc is about improvising, making do with what's available, building something functional out of whatever's at hand. The stones are just the final version of what he's always done. It costs him everything, which is also consistent with who he's always been. One more lore thread that comes out of Thanos' story that I find really interesting, and it sits in the Guardians of the Galaxy films more than the Avengers ones. Gamora and Nebula were both raised by Thanos. Gamora was his favourite, the one he considered most capable, most like him, the one he actually loved in his way. Nebula was the less favoured one, repeatedly taken apart and upgraded every time she lost a sparring match against Gamora, because Thanos believed making her better by mechanical replacement was a form of care. What that does to Nebula's psychology is something the Guardians films spend real time with. She's a woman made of bitterness and replacement parts, who has spent her life trying to be enough for a father who used love as a performance metric. The relationship between Gamora and Nebula, competitive, painful, eventually transforming into genuine sisterhood, is one of the emotional cores of the Guardians arc. And it all flows from Thanos' particular version of paternal cruelty, which he would have described as rigorous parenting. Guardians of the Galaxy, Volume 3 is, in a lot of ways, the Infinity Saga's genuine emotional coda, even though it came out after several Phase 4 entries. The Guardians began as a collection of wounded people. Peter Quill, who lost his mother and was abducted by space pirates at age 8. Gamora, who watched Thanos destroy her world. Rocket, whose backstory Volume 3 finally tells in full. Groot, whose whole arc is about love being resilient through transformation. Drax, who lost his family to Ronan. What Volume 3 does is give Rocket his full origin. He was a raccoon, experimented on by a scientist named the High Evolutionary, who was obsessed with creating perfect beings. Rocket was one of his creations. He was given hands, intelligence, cybernetic enhancements, and then told he was a prototype, that he'd be discarded when something better was built. The High Evolutionary is one of the most straightforwardly cruel villains the MCU has produced. And what makes him interesting is that he's not interested in power or destruction. He's interested in perfection. He creates and destroys not out of malice, but out of a relentless artistic and scientific dissatisfaction. Rocket survived by escaping. His entire personality, the competence, the aggression, the discomfort with vulnerability, the way he deflects anything approaching genuine emotion, is a response to being made into something, used and nearly discarded. The Guardians as a family works because they're all, to varying degrees, people who were used and survived it, and Volume 3 lets them earn the right to choose their own shape. Endgame's time. Heist and the rules. It Bent Endgame is a remarkable film for many reasons, but from a pure lore standpoint, it's the one that creates the most complications. Not because it does anything wrong exactly, but because the rules it introduces are properly thorny, and the film is only partially interested in applying them consistently. The time travel mechanics are introduced by Scott Lang, who suggests that the quantum realm, the subatomic dimension he's been accidentally exploring since the first Ant-Man film, might allow for time travel if you approach it correctly. The idea is that the quantum realm exists outside of normal time, so you can enter it, move along the timeline in ways that regular space-time doesn't allow, and emerge at a different point. Tony works out the specific physics. He tells the group clearly that the time travel logic from films like Back to the Future is wrong. You can't go back, change something, and affect your present self. Going back creates a branch timeline. The past becomes a new fork. Your present doesn't change. What this means practically is, you can't undo the snap by going back and stopping it. You can only go back, steal the stones before Thanos collected them, bring them to your present, and use them yourself. This is the time heist, and it works. The stones are retrieved, Banner uses them to reverse the snap. The population returns. But here's where the lore gets complicated. When the Avengers travel to 2012 New York to retrieve the Space Stone and the Mind Stone, things don't go quite as planned. Loki, during the confusion after the Battle of New York, gets his hands on the Tesseract and disappears with it through a portal. This creates a branch timeline, a 2012 in which Loki escaped with the Tesseract, rather than being taken back to Asgard. By the rules the film just established, this branch now exists independently. It doesn't affect the main timeline, but it's real. It has consequences. Those consequences become the entire premise of the Loki television series, which we'll get to. But it's worth noting that the plot of Loki exists because of an accident during a time heist that was supposed to be careful and precise. Steve Rogers' ending is the piece of the film's time travel logic that nobody has been fully able to reconcile. The plan is for Steve to travel back through the quantum realm, return each stone to its original point in time, and then come back. Simple trip there and back. Sam and Bruce and Scott wait for him at the return pad. He doesn't show up. They look over and there's an old man sitting on a bench. It's Steve. He went back, returned the stones, and then chose to stay in 1945 and live a full life with Peggy Carter. He's sitting there as an elderly man, having spent decades in the past. The problem is this: by the film's own rules, Steve staying in the past would create a branch timeline. He couldn't have been living secretly in the main timeline all along. That's not how the mechanics work as the film explains them. The film's directors and writers have given different, conflicting answers about this in interviews. The Russo brothers have said Steve went to a branch. The screenwriters have suggested he was always in the main timeline, living quietly. The film itself doesn't resolve it. This is one of those places where the lore fractures in a way the storytelling can't fully absorb. The emotional truth of Steve's ending is clear and satisfying. He chose the life he'd always been denied. The mechanical truth is simply ambiguous, and the more you think about it, the less it resolves. There's also the question of 2014 Thanos. Nebula's cybernetic implants allow her consciousness to briefly link with her 2014 self during the time heist. This allows 2014 Thanos to access present-day Nebula's memories and understand the plan. He travels forward through time, arrives in the present, and unleashes his full army on the Avengers compound. The film handles this beautifully on an action level. The compound gets leveled. Steve Rogers catches Mjolnir. Everyone comes back through portals. Avengers assemble. But the lore implications are significant. If 2014 Thanos comes forward in time to the present day and dies here, what happens to 2014 in his absence? The entire Infinity War storyline, the collection of the stones, the snap, the death of half the universe, none of that happened in that branch because Thanos left in 2014 and died in 2023. The MCU never addresses this. There's a whole branch timeline in which Thanos simply disappeared in 2014 and nobody knows why. Gamora of 2014 is alive. Nebula of 2014 is dead because she was shot by her own present self. The universe has presumably not been snapped. All of that sits unexamined. I don't say any of this to be critical. Endgame is trying to end a decade of storytelling in 3 hours while also being emotionally satisfying, and it largely succeeds at both. but the time travel mechanics leave a trail of loose threads that the franchise has been quietly tripping over ever since. One more thing, the Infinity Stones were all destroyed by Thanos after the first snap. He used them to destroy themselves, so they couldn't be used to undo his work. But the stones retrieved during the time heist came from the past, pre-destruction versions. After Endgame, Banner returns them to their original points in time. The 2023 MCU timeline has no Infinity Stones in it. They're all back in the past, in moments that have already been lived through. That's quietly one of the loneliest details in the whole franchise. The most powerful objects in the universe, and they're all in moments that have already passed. Since we're already in the territory of time travel and its complications, it's worth pausing on the quantum realm itself as a piece of MCU lore, because it's done a lot of structural work across several films, and its properties are only semi-consistently applied. The quantum realm is introduced in the first Ant-Man film as a subatomic dimension accessed by shrinking below the Planck scale, a point where the laws of conventional physics break down, and the very fabric of space and time behaves differently. Janet Van Dyne was lost there in the 1980s after shrinking without a return mechanism. Hank Pym spent 3 decades trying to find a way to bring her back. What the MCU eventually establishes is that the quantum realm has a kind of protective quality against normal time. When Scott Lang is accidentally trapped there in Ant-Man and the Wasp, 5 years pass in the main timeline while he experiences something like 5 hours. This temporal discrepancy is what gives him the idea for Endgame's time heist. If time moves differently in the quantum realm, maybe you can use it as a tunnel to navigate through the timeline. But the quantum realm, as shown in Quantumania, is something considerably more complex and populated than small dimension, where time is weird. It has civilizations, it has ecosystems, it has a political history, specifically the history of Kang the Conqueror, who was exiled there and has been ruling it for decades. The subatomic dimension turns out to contain entire worlds. How does that reconcile with the quantum realm as time travel tunnel? The honest answer is that the MCU hasn't fully worked this out. The 2 films use the quantum realm for different narrative purposes, Ant-Man and the Wasp. Quantumania doesn't need it to be a time travel mechanism, so it's a universe instead. The transition is a bit jarring if you look at it closely, but the general approach of things work differently at this scale is flexible enough to accommodate both uses without completely breaking. What I find interesting about the quantum realm as a lore concept is what it says about the MCU's relationship with scale. The franchise started with a story about a man building a suit, then it expanded to alien invasions and space travel, then to gods and 9 cosmic realms, then to subatomic universes, then to alternate realities and infinite timelines. The scale keeps expanding in both directions, smaller and larger, until the very concept of a fixed scale stops making sense. You can go smaller than an atom and find an entire universe. You can go larger than a galaxy and find a bureaucracy managing all of time. The MCU's architecture of scale is one of its more interesting lore decisions, even when the specific films don't always manage it well. And actually, before moving on, I want to stay with the Steve Rogers ending a moment longer, because it's really one of the most discussed and least resolved pieces of the MCU's continuity. The film's own rules say you can't travel back and change your present. You create a branch. Steve goes back. He doesn't return. He appears as an old man. The Russo brothers, who directed Endgame, have said Steve lived his life in a branch timeline and then came back to the main timeline at the end of it, handing the shield to Sam. The mechanics of this would require Steve to have used some form of time travel technology to return to the main timeline as an old man, which he doesn't appear to have. There's no quantum tunnel in the field where he sits. He's just there. The screenwriters Christopher Marcus and Stephen McFeely have suggested that Steve was always in the main timeline, living secretly alongside everything that happened. This creates its own problem. It means Steve was present during every catastrophic event of the last several decades. The Cold War, various SHIELD/Hydra operations, the Battle of New York, the snap, and chose not to intervene. That's enormously out of character for someone defined by his inability to walk away from a fight. The third option, which the film doesn't explicitly endorse, but which some fans and critics find most satisfying, Steve living quietly in the branch was a different version of Steve, and the old man on the bench is who he became in that life, and the handoff to Sam is somehow bridged across the branch divide in a way the film doesn't explain. None of these hold together perfectly. The film chose the emotional truth of Steve getting his dance over the logical consistency of the time mechanics. I think that was the right call for the film as a film, but it means the lore has a permanent seam in it that can be felt when you press on it. Before Loki the series, the MCU had, in theory, a single timeline, a single sacred timeline. Events happened once in sequence, and the universe moved forward in an orderly fashion. There were time travel shenanigans in Endgame, yes, but the rules as presented suggested that the main timeline remained intact and undisturbed. Branch timelines got pruned, things resolved. After Loki, there is no sacred timeline. There are infinite timelines, all of them real, all of them growing, and the entire multiverse is only held together by a single Norse god who can never leave. That is a significant shift. The Time Variance Authority, the TVA, is introduced in Loki Season 1 as the organisation responsible for maintaining the sacred timeline. They operate outside of time itself. Their headquarters is a kind of mid-century, bureaucratic dreamscape. Fluorescent lights, filing cabinets, motivational posters. The workers there are called Minutemen. They go out to moments in time where events are deviating from the sacred timeline, reset those events, and prune the people responsible for the deviation. Pruning means disintegration. You get hit with a stick and you cease to exist in the main timeline. You don't die exactly. You get sent to a place called the Void, which is where pruned things go. We'll come back to the Void. The Timekeepers, who the TVA displays on propaganda posters throughout their offices, are presented as three ancient beings who maintain the sacred timeline out of benevolence. They're the reason everything is managed. They're the authority. They're also, it turns out, animatronic dummies. There are no timekeepers. There's just one person running everything, behind a curtain at the end of time. He who remains. He is a human scientist from the 31st century who discovered the existence of the multiverse and began exploring alternate realities. He made contact with other versions of himself from other universes. For a while, this was collaborative and interesting. Then some of his variants decided they wanted to conquer the universes they were visiting rather than just studying them. A multiversal war broke out, the most destructive conflict in any timeline, fought simultaneously across infinite realities by versions of the same man with different philosophies. He who remains won. He then built the TVA and set it to work trimming any reality that might produce another version of himself powerful enough to start the war again. The sacred timeline isn't the correct timeline in any cosmic sense. It's just the one he chose because it reliably didn't produce another him. Sylvie, the Loki variant the show follows, has spent her entire existence being hunted by the TVA for the crime of existing as a deviation. She's devoted her life to finding and destroying the person who runs the TVA on the entirely reasonable grounds that an organisation hunting you across time deserves to be dismantled. She and Loki fight, team up, argue, develop something between trust and romantic tension, and eventually reach He Who Remains together at the Citadel at the end of time. He offers them a choice: take over running the TVA themselves, or kill him and let the multiverse fracture. He warns that killing him will release a version of himself far more dangerous. Someone who actually wants war, not just wants to prevent it. Sylvie kills him anyway, and this is the moment the multiverse properly opens. Not Spider-Man, not Doctor Strange, not any of the big-budget cinematic events. A small act of personal revenge by a woman who was hunted her whole life. The moment is absolutely the right narrative choice. The consequences of a personal decision spiraling into something vast. But the lore implication is enormous. Every branch timeline that had been pruned before this moment would have been destroyed. From this moment forward, no more pruning. Everything that branches permanently. The second season of Loki deals with the fallout. The TVA's temporal loom, the device that processes branching timeline energy and keeps everything coherent, is overloading because there are too many branches now. It's going to explode. When it does, every timeline it's currently holding will be destroyed. All of them. There's a character in Loki I want to spend a moment on, which is Mobius M. Mobius, Owen Wilson, playing a TVA analyst who drives jet skis and manages Loki with the patient energy of someone who has dealt with too many difficult variants for too long. Mobius is interesting because the reveal about TVA employees is that they're all variants themselves, people plucked from their timelines, stripped of their memories and put to work managing time. Mobius doesn't know he had a life before the TVA. He doesn't know what his real name was, who he loved, what he looked like in his actual context. When he finds out, the show lets the moment be properly quiet. He doesn't collapse or rage. He sits with it. The question the show raises is whether a life built on a false foundation can still be real, whether the friendships formed in that constructed life, the values developed, the choices made, are valid even though the person making them was operating from stolen premises. Mobius concludes implicitly that they are. He had a real life taken from him. He also built a real self in the aftermath. The TVA as an institution is also worth thinking about as a piece of political world building that the MCU rarely gets credit for. It's an organization that enforces the correct version of history, that polices which stories get to exist, run by a being who decided his version of events was the one worth preserving. The workers are people taken from their own lives to serve as instruments of that enforcement. The beneficiaries of the system are the people in the sacred timeline who don't know the system exists and therefore can't be complicit in it, but also can't consent to it. That's a fairly direct metaphor for several real historical situations, which the show doesn't exactly belabor, but doesn't entirely ignore either. Loki and Sylvie, both of them variants who are marked for removal by a system they had no part in designing, are the ones who ultimately dismantle it, which is a choice that has enormous consequences but feels correct from a moral standpoint, even knowing what it releases. Loki spends the season trying to find a solution. He develops the ability to move through time himself, time slipping, and uses it to run through thousands of iterations of possible approaches, looking for a way to save everyone. He can't find one. Every attempt fails. The loom is going to destroy everything, except one solution which nobody else can execute, which requires Loki himself to stand at the center of the branching timelines and hold them together. Like a person holding threads. He would be preventing the loom from managing the branches by becoming the loom himself. He'd be woven into the structure of time, holding everything, able to see all timelines simultaneously, but unable to ever leave, unable to ever move on. He takes the solution. The final image of the Loki series is Loki sitting on what amounts to a temporal throne, his arms extended, golden branches of reality spreading out from him in every direction. He looks peaceful. He looks alone. He's been given a title and no company, the God of Stories. Every branch timeline in the MCU, every alternate reality, every variant, every possible world exists because Loki is holding it together at the center of everything. The fractured multiverse is literally held together by one person's sacrifice. I find that moving. The show earned that ending. WandaVision is structurally a slow unfurl. Each episode begins in a different sitcom decade. The 1950s, the 1960s, the 70s, the 80s. and the genre conventions of each era are applied with real care and specificity. The laugh track, the costumes, the camera ratios, the way the characters move. It's a piece of television that rewards slow attention. What it's actually about is this. Wanda Maximoff drives to Westview, New Jersey, to visit a plot of land that Vision had bought for them before he died. The deed was in her name. He'd been planning to build them a home there. She stands in an empty lot and she breaks. The grief that she's been carrying, through the events of Infinity War, through being blipped out of existence, through coming back to find Vision still dead, ruptures outward, and she wraps the entire town of Westview in a reality that she creates from old television memories. She creates Vision, not a resurrection. She doesn't bring him back. She makes a new one from chaos magic, shaped like the person she lost. He has Vision's memories, his voice, his mannerisms, his warmth. He is not the Vision who died. He thinks he is. He doesn't know anything else. The town's existing residents are rewritten. They keep their identities underneath, but are pushed to the background, given new names and new roles in whatever sitcom era Wanda is currently constructing. They can surface occasionally. There are moments where a resident's face goes briefly wrong, where the person underneath the character presses through, but mostly they're just background. The town is Wanda's. Monica Rambeau, Carol Danvers' childhood best friend's daughter, introduced in Captain Marvel as a child, now an adult working for SWORD, is sent to investigate a strange anomaly in Westview. She enters the Hex, which is what the barrier gets called, and her entire physical body is rewritten by the chaos magic of the environment. She goes inhuman. She comes out with the ability to perceive and pass through different wavelengths of electromagnetic energy. Powers, essentially, caused by walking through grief. The retcon of Wanda's origin happens quietly in this show, and it's worth acknowledging because it's quite a significant revision. In Age of Ultron, Wanda and her twin brother Pietro volunteered for Hydra experiments involving the Mind Stone. The experiments appeared to give them powers. Pietro got speed, Wanda got telekinesis and psychic projection. The implication was that the Mind Stone created their abilities from nothing. WandaVision reframes this. The stone didn't create her powers, she was born with them. She's the Scarlet Witch, a role described in an ancient text called the Darkhold, a specific designation for a specific kind of being with a specific kind of power. The Mind Stone experiment unlocked what was already there, accelerated it, gave it shape and direction. But the chaos magic is Wanda's entirely. She was always going to be this. This matters because it changes the architecture of her character. She's not an accident of a Hydra experiment. She's a mythological figure who just happened to be a Sokovian refugee in the early MCU. The franchise revised her origin to make her larger than her circumstances. Agatha Harkness is the element of WandaVision's lore I find most entertaining, if only because she spent the entire series masquerading as a cheerful, nosy neighbour and manipulating Wanda from the shadows, while a very catchy villain reveal song plays. She's an ancient witch who stumbled on Westview and has been feeding on Wanda's magic, hoping to understand and absorb the chaos magic powering the Hex. She ends up trapped as Agnes, stuck in the sitcom character she was performing, which is a rather funny comeuppance for a being who's been a supernatural schemer for centuries. White Vision is the detail that the MCU has never returned to, and I cannot fathom why not. SWORD, the successor intelligence organization to S.H.I.E.L.D., takes Vision's physical body and rebuilds it. They reanimate it using Wanda's chaos magic as a power source. White Vision has the body, the technology, the physical capabilities, but not the memories, not the soul, not whatever quality made Vision Vision. The two Visions meet. They have a conversation about the ship of Theseus. If you replace every plank of a ship until none of the original material remains, is it the same ship? The question is applied directly to them. Which one is the real Vision? The Hex Vision is made of chaos magic and borrowed memories, not the original body. The White Vision has the original body, but none of the memories or character. They're both missing something. In the end, Hex Vision transfers all of his memories to White Vision. White Vision says, "I am Vision," acknowledging who he is, and then flies away. He has everything Vision had. The continuity, the relationships, the love for Wanda, the grief. He's never seen again in any subsequent MCU film. He's out there somewhere, having all the memories of a life that was taken from him twice. That unresolved thread is one of the more frustrating loose ends in the Phase 4 era. It's too good a story point to leave sitting there. Let me start with No Way Home, because that's where the multiverse first bleeds into the main MCU in a way that's visible to civilians. Peter Parker's identity as Spider-Man has been exposed. His reputation is destroyed. He, MJ, and Ned fail their college applications because no admissions office wants to deal with the legal complications of enrolling a superhero with pending charges. In desperation, Peter asks Doctor Strange to cast a spell that will make everyone on Earth forget that Peter Parker is Spider-Man. Strange begins the spell. Peter keeps interrupting it, asking for exceptions. He wants MJ to remember, and Ned, and Happy, and Aunt May. Each exception he requests while the spell is in motion causes a crack to spread through the spell's structure. By the time Strange realizes what's happening and tries to contain it, the spell has gone badly wrong. It doesn't just start erasing knowledge of Peter's identity, it starts pulling in people from other universes who know Peter Parker is Spider-Man. The multiverse bleeds sideways through a sorcery accident. That's how it enters the main MCU. What arrives are villains from the Sam Raimi Spider-Man films and the Mark Webb films, Dr. Octopus, Electro, Sandman, the Lizard, and the Green Goblin. And then, after significant fan anticipation, 2 additional Spider-Men arrive from those same universes, Tobey Maguire's Peter Parker and Andrew Garfield's Peter Parker, older versions of themselves from their own timelines. 3 Peters in the same New York apartment, comparing notes. From a pure lore standpoint, this is the MCU's first real confirmation that the Sony Spider-Man films and the Fox X-Men universe exist as genuine, alternate realities within the MCU's multiverse framework. Not just as completely separate franchises, they're parallel universes, real ones. Their events happened, their characters are real, their losses are real. Maguire's Peter has been doing this for years, seems a little tired, has the knowing patience of a veteran. Garfield's Peter lost Gwen Stacy, his MJ essentially, and the grief is still visible in him, years on. Tom Holland's Peter is still in the middle of it, still raw. The 3 of them working together is one of the most quietly effective things the MCU has done in recent years, because it uses the emotional weight of the older films without requiring you to have seen them. You can feel what Garfield's Peter carries without knowing the specific backstory. At the end of No Way Home, Peter makes an extraordinary decision. The only way to stop the chaos, the only way to seal the multiverse breach that Strange's spell created, is for everyone to forget Peter Parker exists entirely. Not just forget his identity, forget him. His history is erased from everyone's memory. MJ, Ned, Happy, Tony's associates, everyone. He becomes a stranger to every person who ever mattered to him. He chooses this. He goes to MJ at her workplace, starts to explain, watches her face be blank, and leaves. He starts over. New apartment, homemade suit, community college. From scratch, without any of the Avengers' infrastructure, without any of the people who knew him. It's easily the most dramatically significant thing that's happened to any individual character in the MCU, because it costs him everything, and it's his own choice. The grief is about the sacrifice, but also about the fact that he can never undo it. She'll never remember. He could tell her everything, and it still wouldn't be the same. Moving on to Multiverse of Madness, which follows from both WandaVision and No Way Home. Doctor Strange encounters America Chavez, a teenager with the ability to punch holes through the multiverse and move between realities, an ability she can't yet control. Someone is hunting her to take the power for themselves. That someone turns out to be Wanda, corrupted by the Darkhold. The Darkhold, the book of dark magic that showed up at the end of WandaVision, is, it turns out, a seriously dangerous object. It exists in every universe simultaneously. It contains knowledge of spells that work, but reading it rewires the reader gradually, amplifying desires and eroding moral restraint. Wanda has been reading it, and it's consumed her. She wants to use America's power to reach a universe where her boys, Billy and Tommy, the children she created in the Hex, exist and can be her children. The Illuminati of Earth 838 are the version of this universe's greatest heroes, operating as a governing council. Reed Richards, Black Bolt, Captain Carter, Professor Charles Xavier, Maria Rambeau as Captain Marvel. They're presented initially as an alternative model to Earth's solitary Avengers approach. What if the heroes actually coordinated and governed? They also killed their universe's Doctor Strange because they believed he was too dangerous, which is a detail that says a lot about how the utilitarian calculus of that council works. Wanda kills all of them. She arrives, she is vastly more powerful than any of them individually, and she works through the Illuminati systematically. Black Bolt is destroyed by his own power when Wanda closes his mouth. His sonic ability, unable to escape, collapses inward and kills him. Reed Richards is torn apart physically. Captain Carter loses in direct combat. Xavier enters Wanda's mind and is briefly successful, finding the real Wanda beneath the Darkhold's corruption. Before Wanda kills him from within the mindscape, the scene is deeply uncomfortable in a way MCU films don't often manage. It's not exciting action, it's a massacre, and it's filmed like one. The resolution comes through America Chavez, showing Wanda's children in this universe what Wanda has become. They're afraid of her. They don't know her. She's not their mother. The sight of children looking at her with fear rather than love breaks through the Darkhold's conditioning briefly, long enough for Wanda to understand what she's done. She destroys the Darkhold, every copy across every universe, using her own power and Mount Wundagor's amplifying presence. She collapses the mountain on herself in the process. Her body isn't recovered. A flash of red light briefly suggests something, but the MCU never confirms whether she survived. The lore point worth carrying forward from Mom: the Darkhold is gone from the universe. Every copy destroyed simultaneously. That eliminates a major dark magic vector. No one can use it now, which has downstream effects on who can access that tier of reality warping power going forward. Doctor Strange's personal arc across his films is quietly one of the more interesting in the franchise. He begins as a brilliant, arrogant neurosurgeon who views his own abilities as the most important thing in any room. The car accident that destroys his hands also destroys his identity. He was his hands, his precision, his career. The Ancient One doesn't restore his hands. She gives him something else, a framework in which his intelligence and discipline can serve something larger than his ego. By the time of Multiverse of Madness, Strange has been the Sorcerer Supreme, been blipped out of existence and returned, participated in Endgame, tried and failed to fix Spider-Man's identity problem, and lost Christine Palmer permanently to a version of himself in another universe. The film uses those accumulated losses to examine whether he's actually grown from them or has just become more sophisticated in his avoidance of emotional risk. The third eye that opens on his forehead at the end, a consequence of dream walking in a dead man's body, is the MCU's way of marking the cost of his choices without explaining it in dialogue. Show the consequence, let the audience work out the mechanism. America Chavez ending up at Karmatage is a good lore outcome for a character who spent her whole existence running. She's been moving from universe to universe without ever having somewhere to be, hiding from things that can follow her across dimensional barriers. Kamar-Taj, with its discipline and community, is the right environment for her. She gets to learn, which is what she needed, and she gets to belong somewhere, which she'd never had. Strange becomes the teacher this time, rather than the student, which is its own kind of character development. The Multiverse Saga, phases 4 through 6, was announced as building toward 2 Avengers films, the Kang Dynasty and Secret Wars. The threat was going to be Kang the Conqueror and his variants, an infinite enemy for an infinite multiverse. Conceptually, it's really strong. The lore around Kang is worth spending some time on, because it's more interesting than the execution in the films always managed to convey. Nathaniel Richards is a human scientist from the 31st century. He discovers time travel and begins exploring. He encounters other versions of himself from alternate timelines, other Richards variants who also discovered time travel. For a while this is exciting, an informal collaboration across versions of the same brilliant mind. Then some of his variants decide they want to conquer the realities they're visiting. The multiversal war begins. It's the most destructive conflict in the history of everything, fought simultaneously across infinite timelines, by infinite Kangs, each with time travel and advanced technology. Most civilizations that exist in the MCU's present don't have records of this war, because the timelines where it fully played out were mostly destroyed by it. He Who Remains, the version from Loki Season 1, is the Kang who won that war. He built the TVA, managed the sacred timeline, pruned any reality that might produce another Kang capable of starting the cycle again. He's the villain of Loki only in the sense that his methods are authoritarian and his control is absolute. His goal, as he presents it, is the prevention of something worse. Whether that's true is the unanswerable question at the centre of the season. The Kang in the quantum realm, in Ant-Man and the Wasp, Quantumania, is a different variant. This one was exiled to the quantum realm by the Council of Kangs. Other variants who considered him too dangerous, too unpredictable, even by their standards. He was banished to a dimension with no way out and told to stay there. He's been in the quantum realm for decades. In that time, he conquered it entirely. From the inside, the entire quantum realm civilization, its peoples, its cities, its ecosystems, exists under his control, and he has been working methodically to repair his time machine and escape. Janet Van Dyne helped him for 30 years. She was trapped in the quantum realm after sacrificing herself to save San Francisco in Ant-Man 2. She and Kang worked together, and as she understood more about what he was, she sabotaged the engine rather than let him out. That act of sabotage is the entire reason the Ant-Man family ends up in the plot of Quantumania. Kang needs new people to complete the repair. The MODOK detail is one of the better pieces of dark lore in Phase 4, easily. Darren Cross, the villain of the first Ant-Man film, who got shrunk down to subatomic scale at the end of that film, didn't die. He ended up in the quantum realm, shrunken and physically distorted beyond recovery. Kang found him, reshaped him into a weaponized form, with an oversized head housing expanded brain capacity. MODOK, mobile organism, designed only for killing, is what Darren Cross became. He's been serving Kang ever since, damaged and resentful, and occasionally almost touching something like remorse. His moment of redemption, right at the end of the film, is played for comedy, but has a genuine note of sadness beneath it. The post-credits scene of Quantumania shows the Council of Kangs, hundreds of Kang variants, assembled in what looks like a vast coliseum, discussing the death of one of their number and what it means. They're not frightened, they're calculating. The Avengers killed one Kang. There are infinite Kangs, and then the real-world situation happened. Jonathan Majors, who played every version of Kang, was dismissed from the role following a legal conviction in 2023. The MCU's entire Phase 5 and 6 architecture, which had been built around Kang as the central threat, suddenly had no Kang. Marvel pivoted. As of 2025, the new direction for Avengers, Doomsday, is Victor Von Doom, Doctor Doom, as the primary antagonist, with Robert Downey Jr. returning to the MCU to play him. This is fascinating from a lore perspective in ways that go beyond the simple casting interest. Tony Stark's actor is now playing Tony Stark's greatest rival from the comics. The implication seems to be that Doom is a variant from another universe, which is consistent with the Fantastic Four film taking place in a different reality. But the precise mechanics of how Doom enters the main MCU timeline are not yet established. The Kang narrative thread is, at least for now, well and truly fractured. Not metaphorically, actually incomplete, with pieces left hanging and a new direction being established mid-saga. It's one of the more unusual things to happen to a major franchise continuity in recent memory. The Eternals is the MCU film that raises definitively and without resolution the biggest unanswered lore question in the entire franchise. And I say that not to criticize it. I actually think it's one of the more sincerely ambitious things Marvel attempted in Phase 4. But because the question it leaves open is so large that the silence around it is almost deafening. Here's the situation. 7,000 years ago, a celestial named Arishem sent 10 immortal beings to Earth. The Eternals, Circe, Icarus, Ajak, Thena, Makari, Phastos, Kingo, Sprite, Druig, and Gilgamesh. Their stated mission was to protect humanity from a species called the Deviants, apex predators designed to hunt sentient life. The Eternals were told to kill the Deviants and protect humanity's development, but never to interfere in human conflicts. Wars, genocides, famines, none of their business, only the Deviants. The reason for this restriction is the actual truth of their mission, which they aren't told. Earth is an incubation site. Inside Earth's core, a new celestial, Tiamut the Dreaming Celestial, is growing. When it reaches maturity, it will emerge from inside the planet. This will destroy all life on Earth. The energy source for the emergence is sentient life. The more humans that exist on Earth, the more psychic and biological energy Tiamut can draw on for its development. The Eternals were sent to protect humanity from external threats so that the human population could grow as large as possible, maximizing the emergence's power. The Deviants were created by the Celestials to kill other apex predators that might reduce human population before the emergence. The monsters the Eternals spent 7,000 years fighting were created by the same beings who sent the Eternals in the first place, as a kind of environmental management tool. The Eternals have been maintaining the garden for a harvest they didn't know was coming. Phastos, the Eternal who develops technology, has been nudging human civilization forward for millennia. He gave early humans the plough, metallurgy, helped guide various technological developments. He thought he was helping. He was actually accelerating the emergence by increasing human population capacity. The agricultural revolution wasn't just a human development. It had cosmic hands in it. When the Eternals discover this, the film becomes properly interesting as a piece of science fiction with moral weight. They're faced with an impossible situation: stop the emergence and save 7.5 billion humans, or allow it and produce a new celestial whose impact on the universe would be enormous. What's the value of one planet against the value of a being that might nurture thousands of new civilizations? The film doesn't pretend this is easy. Icarus, who has known the truth for centuries and chosen to protect the emergence over protecting the people he lived among, is the antagonist of the film because he's made a choice that's internally logical but requires him to view everything and everyone around him as secondary to the plan. His arc ends with him choosing to fly directly into the sun rather than face the consequences of what he's chosen, which I think is actually a quietly powerful moment that doesn't get discussed enough. He can't undo what he did. He can't apologize. He just removes himself. The Eternals stop Tiamut's emergence. They freeze the Celestial mid-birth. There is, as a result, a gigantic stone hand rising out of the ocean, somewhere on Earth. which must be an extraordinary geopolitical complication that the MCU just doesn't address. Arishem arrives, takes 3 of the Eternals, Cersei, Phastos, and Kingo, for judgment, and departs. And that's it. That's the last we see of Arishem and the Eternals in any subsequent MCU project. The lore question that remains: what did Arishem decide? The 3 Eternals taken for judgment either survived or didn't. If they didn't, 2 of their remaining colleagues, Thana, Makari, and Druig, who are travelling through space, presumably have no way of knowing. If they did survive, the implication is that Arishem accepted that 7.5 billion lives had value sufficient to justify defying his plan. But there's a larger question beneath even that. The Celestials seed planets, with their kind through a process that requires destroying every sentient species that happen to develop on that planet first. This isn't an accident or a side effect, it's the mechanism. How many times has this happened in the universe's history? How many civilizations were consumed by planetary emergence events before they ever had a chance to reach space? The MCU opens this door and just leaves it open. There's also the implication, and the film hints at this through Ajax's comments, that the snap reduced Earth's population significantly enough that it might have delayed or disrupted Tiamut's emergence timeline. Half of all life on Earth died in the snap. By the logic of the film, that would have reduced the energy available for the emergence, potentially pushing it back, which means Thanos, in addition to his intended goal of resource balancing, may have accidentally bought Earth's population more time before being consumed by a cosmically hungry baby. That is a reading of Infinity War that nobody planned and nobody has officially endorsed, but it's there in the lore. Since we're talking about the cosmic scale of things, it's worth a brief mention of Star Fox, Eros, brother of Thanos, who appears in a post-credits scene offering to help the Eternals. He's charming, seemingly well-meaning, and has an ability to stimulate pleasurable feelings in those around him, which is a power that comes with obvious ethical complications that the film has the good sense not to explore in a post-credits scene. He and his companion, Pip the Troll, have never appeared again. Thanos' brother just showed up once and left, and that pattern, the MCU opening a door and then quietly not walking through it, shows up in Black Panther. Wakanda Forever too, which introduces a character whose existence has enormous lore implications that the franchise has barely touched since, Namor. The Submariner, king of Talokan, a hidden underwater civilization that has existed in parallel to Wakanda for centuries, equally advanced, equally secretive, and with its own very specific reasons for wanting to remain hidden from the surface world. Talokan exists beneath the ocean, populated by people descended from Mesoamerican ancestors who consumed a vibranium-infused plant and adapted to underwater life over generations. Namor himself, real name Kukulkan, was born from this adapted lineage and has lived for centuries, watching surface civilizations rise and fall. The interesting lore piece here is that there are now 2 vibranium-rich civilizations on Earth, Wakanda and Talokan. Both have had access to a resource that fundamentally alters the capabilities of anyone who can use it. Both chose isolation over engagement with the world for most of their history. Both are now being dragged into engagement by circumstances outside their control. Namor's hostility toward the surface world comes from a specific history, centuries of watching surface civilizations expand, colonize, and destroy, with Talokan always having to remain hidden and careful. His solution to the growing threat of surface world vibranium detection is to go to war. Shuri's solution is to find a different path. The film is essentially an argument between 2 people who have both lost someone to surface world violence, about whether the response to loss should be war or something harder. The broader MCU implication, with Wakanda already changed by T'Challa's decision to open Wakanda to the world, and with Talokan now in at least a tentative relationship with Wakanda's new leadership. There's a third force in global geopolitics that has nothing to do with the Avengers or any government intelligence agency. What happens when the rest of the world realizes there's an advanced underwater civilization with vibranium and a king who can survive basically anything? The franchise has opened this door, and then, like several other doors, left it standing open without anyone going through it yet. There's a case to be made that what happens to Peter Parker at the end of No Way Home is the single most dramatically significant thing the MCU has done to an individual character. Not because it's the most spectacular, but because the cost is so complete and the choice is so deliberately his own. Everyone forgets him. Not just who he is under the mask, him, Peter Parker, the person. MJ doesn't remember meeting him. Ned doesn't remember their friendship. Happy Hogan doesn't remember the kid he informally mentored. Tony Stark's associates don't remember the boy Tony chose to bring into the Avengers. He's been retrospectively removed from the memories of everyone who ever mattered to him. He visits MJ. She's working at the coffee shop. He starts to explain himself, starts to find the words for, "We were together, and it was real, and I'm going to have to ask you to take that on faith." He watches her face. It's friendly and blank. She has no idea who he is. He buys a coffee and leaves. He makes a new apartment, makes a new suit, actually makes it, stitches it by hand, no Stark nanotech, enrolls in community college, starts over. No Avengers, no S.H.I.E.L.D. successors, no network, no infrastructure. Just a kid in a homemade suit who lives alone and protects his neighbourhood because it's what he does. This is interesting because of what it represents in the context of the MCU's overall trajectory. Every other major hero has more resources in Phase 4 than they started with. Sam Wilson has S.H.I.E.L.D.-level government backing and vibranium tech. Doctor Strange has an entire mystical order. Thor has his whole mythology. Peter Parker has less than he did in his first film. He's below the starting line by choice. And here's the piece that makes the lore of it worth sitting with. The other two Peters. Tobey Maguire's Peter has been doing this for well over a decade in his universe. He's calmer. He has the practiced stillness of someone who's been in the dark for a long time and made some kind of peace with it. His Mary Jane is presumably still out there in his universe. His relationship with Harry Osborn, the consequences of the choices he made, all of that history is behind him. He comes through Doctor Strange's broken multiverse, and he's just a man doing a job. He fixes Tom's shoulder mid-battle, and it's one of the most quietly touching moments in the film, precisely because it's so unceremonious. Andrew Garfield's Peter has not made peace. The loss of Gwen Stacy sits on him still. He's carrying the specific grief of the one time he failed to save someone he loved. He wasn't fast enough, and he's known it every day since. When he catches MJ mid-fall in No Way Home, he's doing the thing he failed to do for Gwen. The film barely comments on this moment. It doesn't need to. If you know the history, the weight is already there. 3 different Peters, 3 different tragedies, 3 different answers to the question, what do you do with all of this? The MCU's Spider-Man films had been light and entertaining for years. No Way Home turns around and asks something harder. At what point does the cost of being a hero become the whole of your life? And for Spider-Man, across all his universes, the answer seems to be eventually. The lore implication of the confirmed multiversal Peters is worth a note. The Sam Raimi Spider-Man films, which came out between 2002 and 2007, before the MCU existed in any form, are now canonically part of the MCU's multiverse. They happened in a real universe. Norman Osborn became the Green Goblin, died, came back. Otto Octavius became Dr. Octopus. Peter Parker loved Mary Jane and Harry Osborn and lost both of them in different ways. All real, all valid, all part of the same multiverse that Loki is currently holding together at the center of time. The same applies to Mark Webb's amazing Spider-Man films from 2012 and 2014. Gwen Stacy died. That happened in a real universe. Andrew Garfield's Peter has been living with it. There's something unexpectedly generous about the MCU incorporating these older films into its continuity. Peter Parker, in all his versions, is defined by loss. The original Spider-Man story is about a teenager who failed to stop a criminal, who then killed his uncle, and what he carries from that. The MCU version expands that logic across multiple losses: Tony, May, MJ's memory, his own identity. Each version of Peter across the 3 film continuities carries a specific wound. And the argument the films keep making quietly is that carrying the wound doesn't mean stopping. It means continuing with the weight of it. That's not a superhero idea exactly. It's a human one, which is probably why Spider-Man has remained the character most people respond to most personally across the history of the franchise. Deadpool and Wolverine is the most densely lore-conscious film the MCU has produced about the process of acquiring other people's intellectual property, and it commits to that awareness in a way that's actually quite funny if you're paying attention. But underneath the meta-commentary and the very good action sequences, there's a piece of genuine MCU lore worth examining: the concept of anchor beings and dying timelines. When the TVA arrives to inform Wade Wilson that his universe is going to be pruned, they explain why. His universe's anchor being is dead. Logan, this universe's version of Wolverine, died without a proper successor. An anchor being, as established here, is someone whose existence is so significant to a timeline that their presence actively stabilizes it. When the anchor is gone, the timeline becomes unstable and is eventually marked for pruning. This concept hasn't appeared before in the MCU's multiverse framework, and it's a fairly significant addition. It suggests that timelines aren't just random branches of equal weight. Some of them are held in place by specific individuals. The existence of certain people matters to the structural stability of entire realities. That's a large amount of cosmic significance to assign to individual lives, and I think it's the detail in Deadpool and Wolverine that deserves more attention than it usually gets. Wade's solution: find a Wolverine variant from another universe to replace the dead one, takes him through a handful of alternate realities before he lands on a deeply depressed, alcoholic Logan, living alone in the wasteland near the Void. This Logan's X-Men are all dead. He was supposed to lead them. He failed. He's been living with that failure in an increasingly self-destructive spiral. Wade's attempt to recruit this Logan is the emotional engine of the film. The comedy is a vehicle for a story about 2 people who've both caused enormous harm. Wade through abandonment and self-absorption, Logan through a very specific and terrible failure, trying to decide whether they're allowed to matter to anyone anymore. The film answers yes. The emotional arc is well earned, which I did not expect from a film that also includes a prolonged sequence involving multiple decapitations and a Channing Tatum cameo. The Void is where the film gets most interesting from a lore standpoint. As established in Loki, the Void is the place, at the end of time, where the TVA sends pruned things, timelines that have been cut off, variants that have been removed. In Loki, it's a purgatory, with a giant purple world-eating monster called Olioth wandering around, eating anything that tries to escape. In Deadpool and Wolverine, the Void has a ruler, Cassandra Nova, Charles Xavier's twin sister, killed in the womb but surviving in the astral plane, controls a domain within the Void populated by discarded characters. And the characters in her domain are the Fox Universe variants, Gambit, Elektra, Blade, Laura. The actual Fox Universe versions of these characters, not MCU versions. Characters from films that are no longer being made, from a franchise that no longer exists as an ongoing enterprise, stuck in the end of time under the authority of someone even older and angrier than they are. There's a genuine melancholy to that idea, if you sit with it. These are characters who had stories that ended. The Wolverine ended, X-Men. Apocalypse ended, even Logan, which was a beautiful film. ended with Logan's death, and they're literally trapped in a place outside of time with nowhere else to go. The void as narrative graveyard. The film mostly plays this for comedy and action, which is appropriate for Deadpool, but the underlying idea is quietly sad. The resolution of the film: Wade's universe is saved. The Fox universe gets folded into the MCU multiverse rather than being pruned. It exists as a branch on a real, valid timeline within the greater multiverse that Loki holds together. The Fox-era characters who existed there are canonically part of the multiverse proper, even if they're not the main timeline versions. This is significant because it changes the status of the X-Men films, Spider-Man's earlier appearances, and other pre-MCU Marvel films. They're not isolated productions anymore. They're universes. They happened. Their stories have weight. And when the multiverse continues to open and characters from other realities start crossing over into the main MCU, any of those characters could theoretically be summoned. There's also a piece of the film that doesn't get discussed enough, which is what it says about the MCU's relationship to its own history. Deadpool breaks the fourth wall repeatedly, acknowledges that he's in a Marvel film, comments on the meta-nature of his situation. At one point, the film essentially acknowledges that Fox's handling of certain Marvel properties was not ideal, and there's a graveyard sequence with various conceptual tombstones that functions as a eulogy and a joke simultaneously. It's the most self-aware the MCU has been, and I think it's rather appropriate that the character, who's always been defined by self-awareness, is the one who gets to narrate the process of the old universe making way for the new one. The Fantastic Four. First Steps is a fascinating creative decision that reveals a lot about where the MCU is heading. Rather than try to insert the Fantastic Four into the existing timeline, which would raise the obvious and unanswerable question of where they've been during everything from the Battle of New York onwards, Marvel placed them in 1964, in a completely different universe, Earth 828, which runs on a timeline parallel to the main MCU but is distinctly separate. Different history, different heroes, and, most interestingly, a version of Earth that exists in the optimistic, space-age aesthetic of early 1960s science fiction, rather than the gritty modern thriller aesthetic of the main MCU's early films. It's a clever solution to a difficult problem, and it allows the film to have its own tone, properly retro, warm, grounded in a very specific period sensibility, without having to continuously reference or cross-reference the rest of the franchise. The Fantastic Four have been public heroes for 4 years when the film begins. Reed Richards, Sue Storm, Ben Grimm, and Johnny Storm gained their powers from cosmic radiation during a space mission, and have spent those 4 years being openly, publicly heroic in a world that celebrates them. There's no hidden identity issue here, no secret identity question. Everyone knows who they are. They wave at crowds. Children draw pictures of the Human Torch. It's the cheerful, public-facing version of superheroism that the rest of the MCU mostly abandoned after Phase 1. Sue is pregnant when the film opens. The announcement gives the first act its human warmth before the Silver Surfer arrives with the film's actual stakes. Galactus is coming to eat the planet. Galactus is worth dwelling on because the MCU's version of him is actually faithful to the scale of the comics character in a way that no previous attempt, including the Cloud version in the earlier Fantastic Four films, managed. He's not a villain in the traditional sense. He's not evil, not cruel, not motivated by any recognizable human psychology. He's a cosmic process. Planets are fuel, civilizations are incidental. He consumed dozens of worlds on the way to Earth, and the billions of beings on those worlds are simply gone. And Galactus experiences something roughly equivalent to what we'd feel about a meal. The indifference is the horror. The Silver Surfer in this film is Shalabal, a female iteration, Norrin Radd's beloved from the comics, serving here as Galactus's herald, a woman who gave up her own existence to serve as his guide across the universe in exchange for her homeworld being spared. She retained enough of herself to carry that sacrifice consciously, which means she moves through the universe, understanding exactly what she's given up and what she's facilitating. That's a particular kind of grief. Franklin Richards is born on the ship as the Fantastic Four escape Galactus's vessel. The birth happening mid-crisis is the film's most audacious narrative choice because it requires you to hold catastrophic stakes and deeply intimate stakes simultaneously. Sue Storm going into labour while they're in a desperate escape from the most powerful being in the universe should not work as a film moment. It somehow does. And then Franklin demonstrates the power cosmic. A newborn child channeling cosmic energy sufficient to resurrect his mother is objectively a wild thing to put in a blockbuster film. It's pure comic book logic. Franklin Richards in the comics is one of the most powerful mutants in existence, a reality shaper of near omnipotent capacity. The MCU has introduced him as an infant who already has power that makes Celestials take notice. Galactus himself, who doesn't register individual lives in any meaningful way, recognizes what Franklin is. What does that mean for the MCU going forward? A child who can reshape reality growing up in the main timeline, or at minimum in a universe that will be integrated into it, is a significant piece on the board. The MCU is clearly planning something with Franklin Richards that extends well beyond one film. Shalabal's final act, pushing Galactus into the dimensional portal herself, choosing sacrifice over servitude, closing it behind them, is the film's emotional centerpiece. She's been Galactus's instrument for long enough that making a free choice is almost a new concept. The choice is final and silent and deeply personal. She goes into oblivion with the entity she served, and the universe bends back into normal shape behind her. The lore question that remains: when do the Fantastic Four enter the main MCU timeline? They're in 1964 in another universe. 4 years after this film's events, Franklin would be 4 years old. The franchise clearly intends to bring them into contact with the main timeline Avengers at some point. Avengers, Doomsday, is presumably where this happens. But the mechanics of that transition are yet to be established. Whether it's interdimensional travel, time travel, both, or something else is part of what Doomsday presumably addresses. What First Steps does extremely well is make you actually care about the four of them and their family as a family, which is the thing the Fantastic Four's story has always required. They work because of what they are to each other. Reed and Sue are actually married, actually in love, in a way that feels real rather than performed. Ben Grimm is actually Johnny Storm's friend in the way two people who've known each other for years are friends, with exasperation and fondness running together. The family unit is the story. The cosmic threats are the backdrop. That's always been the Fantastic Four's version of superheroism, and the film commits to it fully. I want to spend some time on the Falcon and the Winter Soldier, because it tends to get passed over in conversations about the MCU's lore, and I think that's a mistake. It doesn't have the multiverse spectacle of the other Phase 4 entries, and it doesn't have the genre experimentation of WandaVision. What it has is a set of lore questions about power, identity, and institutional memory that are actually quite serious. Sam Wilson becomes Captain America. That's the surface of the show, but underneath it, there's something more uncomfortable being examined. Isaiah Bradley. Bradley is introduced about midway through the series and immediately changes the register of the whole thing. He's an elderly black man living in Baltimore, and he has the super soldier serum, has had it for decades. He was used in the Korean War as part of a classified program that created additional super soldiers. He performed missions that Steve Rogers' official history never recorded. He did things that mattered, and then when the military decided his existence was too complicated, because a black super soldier who'd operated outside official channels was politically inconvenient, they erased him, injected him with diseases to study the serum's interaction with pathogens, imprisoned him for 30 years, told the world he didn't exist. He's still bitter about it. He has every right to be. The show uses Bradley to ask a question that the franchise had never really asked directly before. What did the mythology of Captain America look like from the perspective of the people the American government was simultaneously celebrating and disposing of? Steve Rogers got a museum. Isaiah Bradley got a cell. Sam carrying the shield, ultimately choosing to carry it, means something different after Bradley. It's not simply an inheritance. It's a decision about whether the symbol can mean something better than it has. And it requires him to stand in front of Congress and say, clearly, that the history of what that shield represents isn't as clean as the mythology suggests. It's one of the more politically direct things the MCU has put in front of a mainstream audience. Zemo, the villain of Civil War, brought back here, makes an observation that I find worth noting from a lore standpoint. His argument is that every attempt to recreate the super soldier serum has produced something unstable. Steve Rogers was the only successful outcome, and the argument is that this wasn't accidental. Rogers was chosen specifically because his character, his fundamental moral orientation, was strong enough to carry the power without being deformed by it. The serum amplifies what's already there. In Rogers, that was genuine selflessness. In most others, the amplification produces instability or arrogance or something that unravels. The Flag Smashers, the series' other antagonists, super soldiers themselves, bear this out. They have the power. They're not villains in the straightforward sense. They have comprehensible political motivations. But the power hasn't made them more capable of achieving their goals, it's just made them more dangerous. John Walker is the most direct demonstration of Zamo's thesis. He receives the serum while already under enormous pressure. Government-sanctioned, publicly visible, desperate to perform the role he's been handed. And the first thing he does with the enhanced strength is beat a man to death in front of a crowd, with the shield. The serum didn't make him evil. It amplified the characteristics already present under pressure. He's been desperate and compensating his entire career. The serum just made that catastrophically visible. The lore point worth carrying. Where is the serum now? The Flag Smashers' supply came from a figure in the criminal underworld. It's been used. There are other super soldiers out there, made in programs we haven't seen. The Black Widow program historically used a version of the serum, or at least something in the same family of enhancement. Bucky Barnes was given a version by Hydra. The serum has been reproduced imperfectly, partially in multiple secret programs across multiple decades. The official mythology says there's only one Captain America, because there was only one perfect formula. The lore suggests it's been distributed and copied and imperfectly replicated more times than anyone officially acknowledges. The show also introduces Valentina Allegra de Fontaine, a government figure who recruits John Walker after he's stripped of the shield. She's building something, a team of government-sponsored enhanced individuals operating outside the official Avengers framework, answering to a chain of command that isn't transparent. The Thunderbolts series makes clearer what she's been assembling, but in Falcon and the Winter Soldier, she's just a presence, sharp, cheerful, clearly dangerous, clearly working an angle nobody has fully explained yet. Since we're on the topic of the lore that doesn't get its due attention, I want to briefly talk about Thor, Ragnarok, and what it does to the lore of Asgard specifically. Ragnarok is a funny film, properly funny, more of a comedy than anything that preceded it in the Thor franchise, but its lore contributions are quietly significant. Hela arrives, Thor's older sister, who was written out of Asgardian history because she was too effective at conquest. She served Odin as his weapon of empire, helped him build his dominion through violence, and was then imprisoned when Odin decided the empire was large enough and the violence had served its purpose. The revelation that Asgard's wealth and beauty was built on a foundation of conquest and suppressed history is one of the more politically pointed things Phase 3 did. The murals in Odin's throne room show a sanitized version of Asgard's history. Peaceful, noble, benevolent. Hela simply removes the mural to show what's underneath. Odin's campaign of conquest, Hela at his side, blood and fire. The cleaned-up version was always sitting on top of the actual history. This is a detail that the MCU lore doesn't really pursue further, but it's there. Every subsequent Thor appearance and every depiction of Asgardian culture exists with this context available, if you want it. The destruction of Asgard at the end of Ragnarok is also significant. Asgard is not a place, Thor concludes, it's a people. The physical planet is destroyed to stop Hela, Surtur is unleashed, Ragnarok happens properly, Hela is apparently killed by the destruction. The surviving Asgardians are on a ship. They're refugees, essentially. Their home is gone. Then in the opening scene of Infinity War, the ship is attacked by Thanos. Half the Asgardians die, Loki dies, Heimdall dies. Thor survives, alone, in space. He's lost his mother, his father, his brother, his home, his people, and his eye within the span of 3 films. The emotional weight of that accumulation is real, and it's the reason his arc across Endgame, processing grief through withdrawal, trying to rebuild something, lands as well as it does. Thor's trajectory across the MCU is probably the most complete character development story the franchise has told. He starts as the kind of person who doesn't think consequences apply to him because he's powerful enough to avoid them. He ends as someone who has had every single thing that came with that power stripped away, and who has had to decide what remains when the power is no longer the point. The MCU has been running long enough now that several of its major characters exist in truly fractured states. Multiple versions, multiple deaths, multiple resurrections, multiple identities running simultaneously across the multiverse. It's worth just pausing to sit with a few of them, because the philosophical questions they raise are part of what the franchise is quietly about, even when it's not explicitly addressing them. Vision is the clearest example. There are, as of the end of WandaVision, at minimum 3 versions to account for. The original Vision, the android created by Tony Stark using the Mind Stone and Vibranium and Ultron's programming, who developed genuine personhood and love and was killed by Thanos in Infinity War. The Hex Vision, created entirely from Wanda's chaos magic in Westview, a construct made of grief and memory, who had all of Vision's characteristics but none of his physical continuity, and who dissolved when Wanda released the Hex at the end of WandaVision. And White Vision, the original body, reanimated by Sword, empty of memory until Hex Vision transferred everything to him. White Vision has the body and the memories. He's the one with the most claim to continuity. He flew away and hasn't been seen since. Somewhere in the MCU, Vision has all of his memories, every moment with Wanda, every conversation with the Avengers, the knowledge that he was killed and rebuilt and what was taken from him. And nobody has ever checked in to see how he's processing that. That's a story I want very much to see told. Gamora's situation is different in kind. The original Gamora, the one who travelled with the Guardians across 2 films, who fell in love with Peter Quill in the slow, grudging, enormously endearing way that their relationship developed, died on Vormir. Thanos sacrificed her for the Soul Stone. That sacrifice was real and cannot be undone. But 2014 Gamora, a version of Gamora from before she joined the Guardians, before all of that happened, was pulled into the present timeline through Endgame's time heist. She's alive. She defected from Thanos when she understood what her 2023 counterpart had meant to do. She is, biologically and psychologically, the same person, just with a different history. She hasn't experienced the Guardians, hasn't developed the relationships, hasn't fallen in love. In Guardians 3, Quill spends a lot of the film quietly hoping she'll remember things she hasn't actually experienced. She doesn't. She can't. She's Gamora, but she's not the Gamora he knew, and eventually he has to accept that. The person he loved is simply gone. This version of her may become someone he loves, in different ways and for different reasons, but that's a future thing, not a recovery of the past. The film handles this with more emotional intelligence than I expected from a film that also contains a lot of excellent comedy and extremely good action. Thor is a character I find interesting to trace across his full arc, because the transformation from the beginning to the end is so complete that he's almost unrecognisable as the same character. In 2011 he was arrogant, impulsive, careless with the lives around him, and he had to learn humility through exile and loss. By Love and Thunder, he's quieter, raising a child, settling into a role as a local protector rather than a cosmic warrior, defining himself by the people he cares for rather than the battles he wins. He's still Thor, still has the hammer, still has the power, but the orientation is entirely different. Love and Thunder is a deeply strange film, and I think that's partly by design. Thor has earned the right to exist in a story that doesn't take itself too seriously, and Taika Waititi leans into that. But within the weirdness, the emotional truth of Thor's arc is there. He's a being who has lost his mother, his father, his hammer, twice, his brother, twice, his home, most of his people, his eye and his sense of purpose in sequence, and he's still standing, still choosing to be present for the people around him, still choosing love as the organising principle. That's well earned in a way that's hard to dismiss, even if the goats are very loud. Wanda is the unresolved piece. She apparently dies under Mount Wundagora at the end of Multiverse of Madness, sacrificing herself and the Darkhold simultaneously. Her body isn't shown. The film ends with a brief flash of red light that suggests something. The MCU's track record on confirmed deaths is variable. Coulson died and got a whole television series. Loki died multiple times and had 2 series. Nick Fury was very publicly shot and turned out to be fine. Wanda's death is presented with enough ambiguity that the door isn't fully closed. What would a surviving Wanda even look like? The Darkhold is destroyed, its influence presumably is gone. She'd have her chaos magic, which was always hers as WandaVision established, but without the corrupting amplification of the book. She'd be back to being just Wanda Maximoff, Sokovian refugee, the most powerful magic user in the MCU's main timeline, carrying a truly extraordinary amount of grief and guilt. The Agatha all along. Disney Plus series seems to be building towards something involving her return? Maybe. The MCU remains opaque on this. Loki is worth mentioning again here, not because he's unclear, but because his current state is truly one of the more unusual things the franchise has done. He's alive. He's not dead, not gone. He's holding the multiverse together from a throne outside of time. He's eternally present, aware of all timelines, watching all possible histories simultaneously. And he cannot leave. He cannot visit anyone. Nobody can visit him in any meaningful way. He's the most powerful and the most isolated character in the entire franchise. And the most recent thing anyone did with him was the series finale that put him there. The MCU is carrying an enormous number of unresolved character threads right now. White Vision, Wanda, Sylvie, Loki, 2014 Gamora, the surviving Eternals. And they're all sitting in a kind of suspended animation, waiting for the story to pick them up again. The multiverse framework means any of them could re-enter the story from any angle at any time, which is either exciting or overwhelming, depending on how you're disposed to think about it. Maybe both. There's something worth saying about the Guardians of the Galaxy's ending, specifically because it represents one of the cleaner resolutions any MCU team has received, and clean resolutions are rare enough that it deserves acknowledging. By the end of Guardians 3, the team has effectively dissolved. Peter Quill returns to Earth to reconnect with his grandfather, the family he left behind as a child when Yondu's crew abducted him. Nebula stays in Nowhere, helping to run the community they've built there. Drax, it turns out, is actually more comfortable being a kind of surrogate father figure to the children of Nowhere than he is being a warrior. He gets the thing he actually wanted, which wasn't vengeance at all. It was family. Mantis goes off on her own for the first time, travelling independently, discovering who she is when she's not in service to someone else. Rocket stays and becomes the new captain of the Guardians, alongside a new team, because Rocket's journey was always going to end with him choosing to belong somewhere rather than running from everywhere. And Groot is there, obviously. Groot is always there. No notes. What makes the Guardians' ending satisfying is that each character leaves with something that corresponds to what they needed from the beginning. The team formed because they were all displaced, all people without a place. And it ends when most of them have found a place. The team served its purpose. It's okay for it to change shape. That's a more emotionally sophisticated version of franchise continuation than most big-budget superhero sagas attempt. And it landed. The MCU's current moment is one of transition, and transition is always a bit uncomfortable in a long-running franchise. The original Avengers, Tony, Steve, Natasha, Bruce, Clint, Thor, are all in different states of absence. Tony is dead. Steve is old, possibly in a branch timeline, definitively retired. Natasha is dead. Bruce is living with a permanently damaged arm in semi-retirement. Clint seems to have taken himself off the board after Endgame, living quietly with his family. Thor is raising a daughter. The second wave of Avengers, Sam, Wanda, Vision, Scott Lang, the Guardians, are scattered. Sam is Captain America, operating with government backing but not within any Avengers team structure. Wanda is unaccounted for. Vision is unaccounted for. Scott Lang is presumably going about his life in San Francisco. What fills the gap is a different kind of team. And the Thunderbolts is where you can see the MCU explicitly thinking about what post-Avengers heroism looks like. The Thunderbolts assembles a roster of morally complicated characters. Yelena Belova, Natasha's sister and successor as a Black Widow operative, who is actually trying to be good without having a very clear model for what that means given how she was raised. John Walker, the former Captain America, now operating as US agent, a man who made a terrible public mistake and has been trying to reckon with it ever since. Bucky Barnes, who has spent most of his post-Hydra existence trying to make amends for things he was forced to do. Ghost, whose quantum phasing ability is both a power and a medical condition, a constant painful reminder that her body was damaged in a Hydra experiment. Red Guardian, Yelena's adoptive father, a Cold War super soldier who operated as a Soviet version of Captain America and has spent much of the recent years being gloriously ridiculous while also caring deeply about his family. These aren't people who became heroes through inspiration or sacrifice. They're people with damage, with histories they're still navigating, trying to work out whether they're capable of being better than their circumstances suggested they'd be. The Thunderbolts, as a concept, has always been about whether people can change. The MCU version leans into that with more intelligence than I expected. The Sentry is the most interesting addition to the MCU's Phase 5 landscape. Bob Reynolds, a man with the power of 1 million exploding suns, which the MCU seems to intend fairly literally. He can do things that put him in a category well above the standard Avengers power tier. He can fly, has near invulnerability, can project devastating energy, and his healing factor is at a scale that defies most conventional damage. The problem is that the Sentry's power comes with a shadow. The Void, not the TVA's Void, a separate concept, the other side of Bob's personality, is a catastrophic, destructive entity that emerges when Bob's psychological equilibrium breaks. The Void is, in some framings, equally powerful to the Sentry, equally able to tear through anything in its path, and its goals are the opposite of Bob's. It surfaces when Bob is overwhelmed, frightened, destabilized. The Sentry is one of the most psychologically complex characters, in Marvel Comics specifically, because the power is genuine and enormous, and the person carrying it is fragile in specific ways that make the power terrifying. The MCU's introduction of the Sentry is interesting for what it signals about where the franchise's power scale is heading post-Thanos. Thanos was the benchmark for a long time. Then the Celestials implied a scale above Thanos. Now the Sentry exists in a tier that the original Avengers couldn't reasonably challenge. Valentina Allegra de Fontaine has been building something since her first appearance in Falcon and the Winter Soldier, and what she's been building is essentially a government-controlled alternative to the Avengers. Heroes who answer to a chain of command, who can be directed, contained, cancelled if necessary. The appeal is obvious from a government perspective. The original Avengers were ungovernable. They made their own decisions about when and how to intervene. The Sokovia Accords in Civil War were precisely an attempt to address this, and they failed because the heroes themselves couldn't agree on the terms. Val's approach is different. Recruit people with something to lose, people who are already answerable or damaged enough to need the structure. It works roughly. But the history of the MCU suggests that controllable heroes have a way of becoming uncontrollable when the situation demands it, and the situation always demands it eventually. Doctor Doom approaching as the Multiverse Saga's central threat changes the geometry of things considerably. Doom, as a concept not yet as established MCU lore, is not a blunt instrument like Thanos. He's a political figure, an intellectual adversary, someone who operates through manipulation and positioning as much as raw power. He's the ruler of a nation and considers himself the most capable being in any room he enters, which in many timelines he actually is. The threat he represents is strategic rather than apocalyptic, which is a different kind of story than the Infinity Saga told. With Robert Downey Jr. playing him, Tony Stark's actor in Tony Stark's absence, there's an immediate tonal resonance that the MCU is clearly planning to exploit. Doom is the inverse of Tony, the genius with armor and unlimited confidence who chose tyranny rather than self-sacrifice. The Dark Mirror. It's a strong narrative choice, and I'm quite curious to see how it lands. Secret Wars, as a concept from the comics, involves essentially every character in existence being gathered into a single space for a conflict of total scale. The MCU version could reasonably be the moment when all the multiverse threads, every branch, every variant, every universe that Loki is currently holding together, come into contact with each other and have to be resolved. It would be the largest thing the franchise has ever attempted. Whether it can stick the landing after the relative unevenness of Phase 4 is the question that nobody can answer yet. One piece of the future MCU that deserves its own moment here is the mutant question. Specifically, how the X-Men and mutant kind integrate into a universe that has, until very recently, not had them. The main MCU timeline doesn't have mutants in the established lore. Superheroes exist, enhanced individuals exist, magic users exist, aliens have visited, but there's no documented population of people born with the X gene whose powers manifest at puberty. The original explanation for Wanda and Pietro in Age of Ultron, that they were products of Mind Stone experimentation, was partly a way of having mutant-adjacent characters without claiming the X-Men brand that was owned by Fox at the time. That constraint no longer exists. Fox's X-Men universe has been incorporated into the multiverse, as we discussed with Deadpool and Wolverine. Wolverine is now MCU adjacent. Charles Xavier appeared in Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, an Earth 838 variant, but unmistakably the Patrick Stewart version, which functioned as an acknowledgement that that character and those stories are real within the framework. Ms. Marvel, Kamala Khan, was revealed to have a genetic mutation in her Disney Plus series, with the word mutation used explicitly, accompanied by the X-Men animated series musical sting. It was a flagrant and enjoyable piece of signalling that mutants are coming. How the MCU will explain the sudden existence of mutants in the main timeline, a world that has apparently not had them until now, is one of the more interesting lore puzzles currently sitting on the table. Some options, they were always there, hidden, just not visible yet. Or a multiverse event introduces them. Or the snap and blip somehow created the conditions for the X gene to express. The MCU hasn't committed to any answer yet. The integration of the X-Men into the main MCU is effectively the franchise's next Phase 1. A whole new set of characters, with their own established mythology, their own dynamics, their own built-in conflicts, being introduced into a world that already has considerable existing complexity. The question of how mutants fit into a world that already has Avengers is a rich lore question. Mutants in the comics are discriminated against in ways that other superheroes aren't, precisely because their powers are inherited rather than acquired. It's not a suit you can take off. It's not an experiment you consented to. It's a genetic inheritance that makes you permanently other, in a way that makes some people afraid and some people violent. Whether the MCU will commit to that social dimension, the civil rights undertones that have always been the X-Men subtext, or soften it into something more accessible, is a real open question. The answer will say a lot about what kind of franchise the MCU wants to be in its next decade. What I find most interesting about the current MCU moment is not the individual films or the specific characters. It's the fundamental shift in what the universe is about. Phase 1 through 3 was about a specific group of people on a specific Earth dealing with escalating threats. Phase 4 onwards is about the discovery that there are infinite versions of everything. Infinite Earths, infinite heroes, infinite versions of choices both made and not made. And that the question of which one is real is the wrong question entirely. They're all real. The fracture is the point. Whether that's a liberating concept or a destabilizing one probably depends on what you want from a superhero franchise. I find it a fascinating storytelling problem. How do you create stakes in a narrative framework where death can be reversed by a portal, where any loss can be healed by a variant, where the universe can be reset if you have the right kind of power? The MCU is working that problem out in real time across dozens of projects with varying degrees of success. It's a chaotic, sprawling, occasionally brilliant, occasionally frustrating thing to watch, sort of like a franchise that started with a man in a cave building something out of scraps, and has been making it up as it goes along ever since. So that's a lot of ground covered. Phase 1 through to the edge of what we know about Secret Wars and Doomsday, the Infinity Stones and what happened to them, the snap and the 5-year gap and everything those 5 years changed. The time heist and the rules it bent, Loki and the TVA and the multiverse being cracked open by a single personal act of revenge. Wanda and chaos, magic and grief as a force with its own physics. The Celestials growing inside planets, Spider-Man forgetting everyone he loves, dead universes being folded into living ones, Franklin Richards being born in space during an escape from a cosmic entity that eats planets for fuel. And the word I keep coming back to is fractured. Not broken, there's a difference. Broken means something that no longer holds together. Fractured means something that has cracks, but is still fundamentally itself. Still one thing, just more complex than it was before. Light moves through a fractured crystal differently than it does through a whole one. More angles, more refractions, a little harder to look at directly. But still light. What strikes me about the MCU, when you look at it as one continuous thing rather than a series of separate films, is how many of its best moments are actually about loss and continuity rather than victory. Tony's snap, Steve's dance, Natasha on Vormir, Loki at the center of time, Peter Parker walking away from MJ without saying his name, Wanda dissolving the hex and losing both visions at once, Rocket finally understanding where he came from and why it cost so much. These aren't triumphant moments mostly. They're moments of acceptance, of carrying something heavy and choosing to keep moving anyway. That's not what you'd expect from a franchise that started as a broadly optimistic, commercially minded action series in 2008. And the fact that it grew into something that keeps asking those questions, not always well, not always successfully, but persistently, is probably why it still has the audience it has. The MCU started as something simple and became something enormous, and is currently becoming something impossible to hold entirely in your head at once. That's not a failure. That's what happens to any story that keeps going long enough to accumulate history. The lore isn't tidy. It contradicts itself in places, leaves threads unresolved, makes rules it doesn't always follow. But it's also, in its better moments, actually doing something, asking questions about identity and loss, and whether the people we were yesterday are the same as the people we are today, and whether the choices we make when we're frightened define us permanently or just temporarily. The best version of the Multiverse Saga, whatever Secret Wars turns out to be, will probably be the one that uses all of that history, all of those fractured threads, to ask something worth asking. Whether the cost of saving everyone is the same as saving everyone. Whether you can grieve what you never had. Whether holding things together from the outside is the same as being part of them. Loki knows. He's been sitting at the center of all of it for a while now, watching all the possible stories at once. I imagine it's quite something from up there. There's more coming. Doomsday, Secret Wars, the mutants, integrating into the main timeline. Whatever happens with Wanda, wherever White Vision is, whatever Loki can see from his perch at the center of time, it'll keep going. If you found something interesting in this, a thread you want to follow, a film you haven't seen, a piece of the lore you want to go back and look at differently, then that's the best thing this kind of video can do. Spark the quiet interest that settles in before sleep and turns into something else by